In a bustling downtown bank in Phoenix, Arizona, a 67-year-old woman was about to deliver a lesson that would change her relationship with her son forever. What started as a routine banking transaction turned into a moment of reckoning when Margaret Maggie Chen-Rodriguez faced the consequences of being called embarrassing by the person she loved most. This grandmother, who had built a small empire from nothing, was about to show everyone present what real embarrassment looked like, and why respect isn't negotiable, no matter who you are. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert landscape as Margaret Chen-Rodriguez stood in her spacious kitchen, methodically preparing her famous green chili breakfast burritos. At 67, her hands moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent decades feeding people, first as a struggling single mother running a food cart, then as the owner of 3 successful Mexican-Asian fusion restaurants across Phoenix. Her weathered fingers, adorned with simple gold rings that had survived 40 years of hard work, folded each tortilla with precision. The aroma of roasted chiles and scrambled eggs filled the modern kitchen of her Scottsdale home, a far cry from the one-bedroom apartment where she'd raised her son Marcus alone. "Mom, you don't have to make breakfast every time I visit," Marcus called from the living room, his voice carrying that familiar tone of mild exasperation mixed with affection. "And you don't have to visit your old mother every Sunday, but here we are," Maggie replied in accented English, her voice warm with the musical lilt that came from speaking Spanish as her first language and Mandarin as her second. English had been the last language she'd mastered, learned out of necessity when she'd arrived in America 35 years ago, with nothing but determination and a 2-year-old son. Marcus appeared in the doorway, tall and lean in his expensive weekend casual wear, a Ralph Lauren polo and designer jeans that probably cost more than Maggie had spent on clothes in her first year in America. At 37, he bore little resemblance to the shy little boy who used to help her count quarters from the food cart's daily earnings. His success as a corporate lawyer had transformed him into someone who moved comfortably through Phoenix's elite social circles, someone who belonged in boardrooms and country clubs. "The Chen-Martinez merger documents came through," Marcus announced, settling into one of the kitchen bar stools that Maggie had specifically chosen, because they were the perfect height for her small frame. "We finalized the deal Friday afternoon, $47 million. Maggie paused in her cooking, the significance of the number not lost on her. She'd watched her son work 100-hour weeks for the past 6 months, sacrificing weekends and holidays to close what his firm called the deal of the decade. She turned to face him, her dark eyes bright with pride. "$47 million, she repeated slowly as if testing the weight of the words. "When I started the food cart, I celebrated my first $100 day like I'd won the lottery. And now I'm handling deals worth more than most people see in several lifetimes," Marcus said, but there was something in his voice that wasn't quite satisfaction. Perhaps exhaustion, or maybe the hollow feeling that came with achieving a goal you'd worked toward for so long that you'd forgotten why it mattered. Maggie studied her son's face with the intuition of someone who had been reading his moods since birth. She could see the success etched in his confident posture, the expensive watch, the car keys to a BMW that cost more than she'd made in her first 5 years in business. But she could also see something else, a tightness around his eyes that spoke of stress, of constantly performing, of never quite feeling like he belonged, despite all his achievements. "Your father would be proud," she said quietly, referencing the man Marcus barely remembered, but whose absence had shaped both their lives in different ways. "Dad left before I was 3, Mom. I don't think his opinion matters much at this point." The response was automatic, a shield Marcus had developed over the years whenever conversations drifted toward his father. But Maggie had learned not to push. Instead, she plated the burritos with care, adding fresh salsa verde and a sprinkle of queso fresco. "Tell me about this deal," she said, settling beside him with her own plate. "What made it so special?" Marcus's face lit up as he launched into the details. Complex corporate restructuring, international tax implications, regulatory hurdles that had taken months to navigate. Maggie listened intently, understanding perhaps half of what he said but absorbing every word because this was her son, and his victories were hers regardless of whether she could fully comprehend the intricacies. The client wants to take the team out to celebrate, Marcus continued between bites. Dinner at the Capitol Grill next Friday. Partners, senior associates, everyone who worked on the deal. That sounds wonderful, Maggie said. You should celebrate, you've earned it. Actually, Marcus paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. I was wondering if you'd like to come. As my guest. The client specifically mentioned wanting to meet the families of the team members. Something about understanding the people behind the success. The invitation hung in the air between them, unexpected and precious. In all of Marcus's years at the firm, he'd never invited her to a work function. Their worlds had remained carefully separate. Her restaurants and his law practice, her circle of immigrant entrepreneurs, and his circle of established professionals. You want me to come to dinner with your colleagues? She asked, wanting to be certain she'd understood correctly. The client is actually interested in immigrant success stories. When I mentioned that my mother built a restaurant empire from a food cart, he seemed genuinely intrigued. Said it was exactly the kind of American dream narrative that makes for good conversation. Maggie felt a familiar flutter in her chest. The same sensation she'd experienced when Marcus graduated law school, when he'd bought his first house, when he'd made partner at one of Phoenix's most prestigious firms. Pride mixed with something more complex, a recognition that her son was finally ready to acknowledge her story as part of his success. I would be honored, she said simply. Great. It's black ties, so you'll probably want to get something nice. I can give you the name of the place where Sarah shops. Sarah was Marcus's ex-girlfriend, a corporate executive whose family had belonged to Phoenix society for 3 generations. Their relationship had ended 6 months ago, though Marcus had never explained why. I think I can manage to dress appropriately, Maggie replied with dry humor. I've been to a few fancy events in my time. It was true. As her restaurants had gained recognition, she'd been invited to various charity galas and business dinners. She'd learned to navigate formal settings with the same determination she'd applied to learning English and understanding American business customs. But this felt different. This wasn't her world welcoming her. This was her son's world, finally opening its doors. After Marcus left for his afternoon tennis game at the country club, Maggie stood in her kitchen cleaning dishes and allowing herself to imagine Friday night. She pictured herself in an elegant dress, seated beside her son at a table full of Phoenix's legal elite, sharing stories about building a business from nothing. She imagined Marcus introducing her with pride, his colleagues impressed, not just by his legal acumen but by the woman who had raised him. The daydream was interrupted by the ringing of her phone. The caller ID showed the name of her youngest employee, Sophia, who managed the weekend shift at her newest location. Mrs. Rodriguez, I'm so sorry to bother you on Sunday, but we have a situation. What kind of situation? Maggie asked, immediately shifting into business mode. The walk-in freezer stopped working overnight. We've lost most of the weekend prep, and we're supposed to cater the Hernandez wedding reception tonight. 300 people. Maggie closed her eyes, mentally calculating the logistics. A catering contract that size represented significant revenue, but more importantly, it represented her reputation in the community. The Hernandez family had been customers since her food cart days. Disappointing them wasn't an option. I'll be there in 20 minutes, she said. Call Miguel and ask him to meet us there. And Sophia? Don't panic, we've handled worse. As she grabbed her keys and headed for the door, Maggie felt the familiar rush of crisis management. This was the reality behind the success story that Marcus's colleagues found so compelling. The constant vigilance, the willingness to sacrifice personal time, the understanding that being the boss meant being the one who solved problems that no one else could solve. But as she drove toward the restaurant, she also felt something else. Excitement about Friday night, about the opportunity to finally share her world with her sons, about the possibility that all the years of keeping their lives separate might finally be coming to an end. What she didn't know was that her son was already having second thoughts about the invitation, sitting in his BMW outside the tennis club, staring at his phone, and wondering if asking his mother to dinner with his colleagues had been a terrible mistake. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The emergency at the restaurant had taken 6 hours to resolve. But by Sunday evening, Maggie had orchestrated a minor miracle. She'd called in favors from suppliers across Phoenix, reorganized the entire catering menu, and personally supervised the prep work that would ensure the Hernandez wedding reception went off without a hitch. Her hands were stained with chili powder, her back ached from lifting heavy pots, and her designer blouse from this morning's breakfast with Marcus was now splattered with salsa verde. But as she watched her team execute the emergency plan with the precision of a military operation, Maggie felt the deep satisfaction that came from solving the impossible. This was what Marcus's colleagues would never understand about her success. It wasn't built on boardroom negotiations or legal strategies, but on the willingness to show up at any hour, to do whatever work needed doing, to treat every customer like family. "Mrs. Rodriguez, you should go home," Sophia said, appearing at Maggie's elbow with a concerned expression. "We've got this handled now." "I know you do," Maggie replied, untying her apron. "You all did beautifully today. Make sure everyone gets overtime pay for coming in on their day off." As she drove home through the quiet Sunday evening streets of Phoenix, Maggie found herself thinking about Friday's dinner. The invitation felt like a bridge between two worlds that had remained carefully separate for decades: her world of early morning prep work and customer service, and Marcus's world of client meetings and corporate law. Her phone rang as she pulled into her driveway. The caller ID showed Elena Vasquez, her oldest friend and the woman who had been like a sister to her since they'd both arrived in Phoenix as young mothers with more dreams than money. "I heard about the freezer disaster," Elena said without preamble. "Sophia's cousin called me. Are you okay?" "We saved the wedding," Maggie replied, settling into her favorite chair in the living room. "But I'm too old to be lifting 50-pound pots." "You're 67, not 97. And you've been saying you're too old for restaurant work since you were 50. Elena's voice carried the warm teasing of someone who had watched Maggie overcome obstacle after obstacle for 30 years. "Marcus invited me to dinner with his work colleagues," Maggie said, changing the subject to something that felt more important than her aching back. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. Elena had been there through Marcus's childhood, had watched him transform from a bilingual kid who helped translate for customers at the food cart into a polished professional who spoke carefully modulated English and seemed sometimes like a stranger in his own mother's house. "That's wonderful," Elena said finally, but there was something cautious in her voice. "What's the occasion?" "He closed a big deal. $47 million. The client wants to meet the families of the team members." Maggie couldn't keep the pride out of her voice. "He told them about how I started with the food cart. And how do you feel about that?" It was such a simple question, but it cut to the heart of something Maggie hadn't wanted to examine too closely. How did she feel about Marcus finally acknowledging her story as part of his success? Relief? Pride? A small, wounded part of her that wondered why it had taken 35 years for him to be comfortable introducing her to his professional world. "Proud," she said simply. "Proud that he's successful, proud that he's ready to share our story." "Our story?" Elena repeated thoughtfully. "Maggie, do you remember when Marcus graduated from law school?" Of course she remembered. She'd sat in the back of the auditorium at Arizona State University, wearing the best dress she could afford, watching her son cross the stage to receive his degree. Afterward, there had been a reception for graduates and their families. Marcus had introduced her to a few classmates, but she'd noticed how he'd carefully steered conversations away from her background, how he'd described her simply as "my mother," without mentioning the restaurants or the food cart, or the story of how they'd built their life in America. "He was young," Maggie said, defending him automatically. "He was trying to fit in. He was 25, Maggie, not that young." "And what about when he made partner 3 years ago? Remember that celebration dinner?" Maggie did remember. The firm had hosted a dinner for new partners and their families. Marcus had asked if she wanted to come, but his tone had suggested he hoped she'd decline. She'd made an excuse about needing to work at the restaurant, and they'd both pretended to be disappointed. "That was different," Maggie said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Was it?" "Maggie, I love Marcus like he's my own son. I watched you sacrifice everything to give him opportunities, but I also watched him learn to be ashamed of where he came from. The words hit harder than Elena had probably intended. Maggie sat in her quiet living room, surrounded by photos of Marcus at various stages of his life: his high school graduation, his college commencement, the day he'd bought his first house. In every photo he looked successful, confident, like someone who belonged in whatever world he'd entered. "He's not ashamed," Maggie said, but even as she spoke the words, she wondered if she was trying to convince Elena or herself. "Then why has he never brought a girlfriend to meet you? Why does he only visit on Sunday mornings when none of his friends are likely to see him? Why did it take a client's specific interest in immigrant success stories for him to finally invite you into his professional world?" Each question landed like a small stone thrown into still water, creating ripples that Maggie didn't want to examine. She thought about Marcus's ex-girlfriend Sarah, whom she'd met exactly twice in the 2 years they'd dated. She thought about how Marcus always seemed to schedule their dinners at out-of-the-way restaurants rather than the trendy places where his colleagues might gather. She thought about how he'd learned to speak without any trace of the accent that still colored her own English, how he'd carefully erased any visible connection to his childhood. "Maybe you're right," Maggie admitted quietly. "But this dinner feels different. He seemed genuinely excited about introducing me to his colleagues." "I hope so," Elena said gently. "You deserve to be proud of everything you've accomplished. And Marcus should be proud to be your son, not just when it serves his professional interests." After they hung up, Maggie sat in the growing darkness of her living room, not bothering to turn on the lights. Elena's words had awakened doubts she'd been pushing aside for years. She'd told herself that Marcus's careful separation of their worlds was natural, that successful children often moved in different circles from their parents. But now she wondered if there was something more deliberate in his distance, something that went beyond natural generational differences. She thought about the stories she'd planned to share at Friday's dinner. How she'd started the food cart with borrowed money and a few family recipes. How she'd worked 16-hour days to save enough for the first restaurant. How she'd learned English by watching soap operas and asking customers to correct her pronunciation. These were stories she was proud of. Stories that represented everything she valued about hard work and determination. But as she imagined telling these stories to Marcus's colleagues, she began to see them through different eyes. Would they see her accent as charming or unprofessional? Would they be inspired by her immigrant success story? Or would they view her as an interesting curiosity from a world they didn't understand? More importantly, how would Marcus react when she spoke about their early years? Would he be proud of her stories? Or would he cringe at the reminder of how different their life had been from the polished narrative he'd constructed about his background? The questions circled in her mind as she finally made her way to bed. Friday's dinner was still 5 days away, but already it felt like more than just a celebration. It felt like a test of Marcus's pride in his family, of her ability to navigate his world, of whether the bridge between their two lives could support the weight of 35 years of careful distance. As she drifted off to sleep, Maggie found herself hoping that Elena's concerns were unfounded, that Marcus's invitation represented genuine growth rather than professional convenience. But a small part of her couldn't shake the feeling that Friday night might reveal truths about their relationship that neither of them was prepared to face. Monday morning brought Marcus to his corner office on the 32nd floor of One Central Park, where floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of downtown Phoenix. The weekend's triumph should have left him energized, but instead he found himself staring at his computer screen, unable to focus on the stack of new cases that had appeared on his desk. His assistant, Jennifer, knocked and entered with her usual efficiency. "The partners' meeting is in 10 minutes, she announced, setting a fresh cup of coffee on his desk. "And your mother called. She wanted to confirm the dress code for Friday's dinner." Marcus felt his stomach tighten at the mention of his mother. "What did you tell her?" "Black tie, like you specified. She seemed excited." Jennifer paused, studying his expression with the intuition of someone who'd worked for him for 3 years. "Is everything okay? You seem tense for someone who just closed the biggest deal of his career." "I'm fine," Marcus replied automatically, the same response he'd been giving since childhood whenever someone questioned his emotional state. "Just thinking through some logistics for Friday." After Jennifer left, Marcus leaned back in his leather chair and tried to analyze the knot of anxiety that had been growing in his chest since Sunday. The dinner invitation had seemed like a good idea when he'd extended it, a gesture that would please the client while finally acknowledging his mother's role in his success. But now, 48 hours later, he was questioning everything about the decision. His phone buzzed with a text from his law school friend Derek. "Heard about the Chen-Rodriguez deal. Drinks at the Phoenician tonight to celebrate?" Marcus stared at the message, remembering the last time he'd met Derek's circle for drinks. The conversation had inevitably turned to family backgrounds, who'd gone to which prep schools, whose parents belonged to which country clubs, whose families had been in Phoenix society for generations. Marcus had navigated the conversation carefully, mentioning his mother's business success while glossing over the details of how she'd achieved it. The partners' meeting passed in a blur of congratulations and discussion about future client prospects. Senior partner Robert Caldwell, whose family name graced buildings throughout Phoenix, pulled Marcus aside afterward. "Outstanding work on the Chen-Rodriguez deal," Caldwell said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. "The client was particularly impressed with your background story. Something about your mother building a business empire from humble beginnings?" "That's right," Marcus replied, feeling the familiar need to calibrate his response carefully. "She started with a food cart and built it into a successful restaurant chain." "Fascinating. The American dream personified. Henderson is very interested in meeting her at Friday's dinner. He's always been drawn to authentic success stories." The word authentic hung in the air between them, and Marcus wondered if Caldwell meant it as a compliment, or if there was something subtly condescending in his tone. Richard Henderson, the client, was old money East Coast establishment, the kind of man who collected immigrant success stories the way others collected art, finding them interesting as curiosities rather than recognizing them as equal achievements. "She's looking forward to it," Marcus said, and realized as he spoke that he wasn't sure if that was true for him. That evening, Marcus found himself at happy hour with Derek and 3 other attorneys from competing firms. They'd claimed a corner table at the Phoenician's bar, where the clientele consisted primarily of Phoenix's professional elite unwinding after another day of high-stakes deal-making. "So Marcus," said Victoria Chen, "no relation to the Chen-Rodriguez deal, despite the surname. I heard you're bringing family to the Henderson celebration dinner. That's unusual for a business function." Victoria worked for a rival firm and had been competing with Marcus for high-profile clients since they'd both made partner. Her comment carried the subtle edge that marked all their interactions, friendly on the surface but probing for weaknesses underneath. "Henderson specifically requested it," Marcus replied, taking a larger sip of his whiskey than he'd intended. "He's interested in meeting the team members' families." "How democratic of him," Victoria said, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm sure your family will be fascinating dinner conversation. Remind me what your mother does again?" "She owns restaurants," Marcus said, the simplification rolling off his tongue with practiced ease. "Oh, how wonderful. Fine dining? Mexican-Asian fusion. 3 locations." "How exotic," Derek chimed in, either oblivious to or deliberately ignoring the tension in the conversation. "I love authentic ethnic food. There's this amazing little hole-in-the-wall place near my gym that makes the most incredible tacos." Marcus felt his jaw clench at the casual dismissal embedded in Derek's comment. The assumption that authentic ethnic food came from hole-in-the-wall places, that his mother's carefully crafted fusion cuisine could be lumped together with any random taco shop, that success in the restaurant industry somehow counted less than success in law or finance. "It's actually quite sophisticated," Marcus said, but his voice sounded defensive even to his own ears. "She's won several culinary awards and been featured in Phoenix magazine." "I'm sure she has," Victoria replied smoothly. "It's just so different from what we usually see at these corporate functions. Henderson's crowd tends to be very traditional in their expectations." The comment landed like a small bomb in Marcus's chest. Traditional expectations. Translation: his mother, with her accent and her immigrant story and her hands-on approach to business, didn't fit the mold of what Henderson's crowd expected from the family members of elite attorneys. "She'll be fine," Marcus said, But even as he spoke, he was imagining Friday night through new eyes. His mother, animated in conversation, gesturing with her hands the way she always did when she was excited. Her accent becoming more pronounced when she was nervous, the way it always had during parent-teacher conferences and school events. Her stories about the food cart and the early struggles, told with the pride of someone who'd overcome impossible odds, but potentially sounding like poverty narratives to people who'd never known genuine hardship. "Of course she will," Derek said, with the hearty enthusiasm of someone trying to diffuse tension. "These dinners are always more fun with some variety in the guest list. Gets boring when everyone's from the same background. Variety." As if his mother was a interesting addition to the menu rather than the reason he'd been able to attend law school in the first place. The conversation moved on to other topics, but Marcus found himself only half listening. Instead, he was remembering other moments when his worlds had collided. His college graduation party, where his mother had been the only parent who didn't speak English as a first language. The law school awards ceremony, where she'd cheered too loudly when his name was called. The time she'd visited his apartment and asked, with genuine curiosity, why he'd removed all the photos of their early years together. Each memory felt like evidence in a case he didn't want to prosecute. The case for why keeping his mother away from his professional life had been a form of self-protection rather than shame. But as he sat in the elegant bar, surrounded by colleagues who would never understand what it meant to grow up translating for your parent at the grocery store, Marcus began to wonder if the protection had been worth the cost. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Picked out a beautiful dress for Friday. Can't wait to meet your colleagues and tell them how proud I am of you." The simple message hit him like a punch to the stomach. His mother's excitement was genuine, uncomplicated by the social calculations that had been consuming his thoughts for 2 days. She was proud of him, proud to be invited into his world, completely unaware that he was already having second thoughts about whether she belonged there. Marcus finished his drink and made excuses about early meetings, leaving the bar with his mind churning. As he drove home through the Phoenix night, he found himself at a crossroads he'd been avoiding for years. Friday's dinner was no longer just about celebrating a business success. It was about deciding what kind of son he wanted to be, what kind of man he'd become, and whether the price of belonging in his chosen world was worth the cost of denying where he'd come from. The decision felt impossible, weighted with years of careful image management, and the fear that authenticity might cost him everything he'd worked to achieve. Tuesday afternoon found Marcus at the Arizona Biltmore Country Club, where he'd maintained a membership for the past 5 years as part of what his mentor had called, quote, essential networking infrastructure. The manicured golf course stretched out under the desert sun, and the club's dining room buzzed with the quiet conversations of Phoenix's business elite conducting deals over perfectly prepared lunches. Marcus had arranged to meet Richard Henderson for what was ostensibly a casual follow-up to their successful deal, but both men understood that these informal meetings were where real business relationships were forged. Henderson, a silver-haired man in his early 60s, carried himself with the effortless confidence that came from generations of family wealth and East Coast establishment connections. "Outstanding work on the merger," Henderson said as they settled into leather chairs overlooking the 18th green. "My board was particularly impressed with the international tax structuring. Saved us nearly $12 million in the first year alone." "We're pleased with the outcome," Marcus replied, falling easily into the careful modesty that marked all his professional interactions. Never oversell, never appear too eager. Always leave room for the client to feel they'd discovered your value themselves. "I've been thinking about our conversation regarding Friday's dinner," Henderson continued, signaling the waiter for another round of drinks. "Your family background is quite remarkable. Tell me more about your mother's business journey." Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the same sensation he'd experienced whenever teachers had asked about his home life during parent conferences. He'd learned long ago to craft a narrative that was truthful but sanitized, impressive but not too raw with struggle. "She immigrated from Mexico in the late 80s, Marcus began, choosing his words carefully. "Started with a small food service operation and gradually expanded into restaurant ownership. She's built quite a successful enterprise." "Fascinating," Henderson mused. "The classic American immigrant success story. My wife, Catherine, will be delighted to meet her. She's very involved with the Phoenix Art Museum's multicultural initiatives, always looking for authentic voices to feature in their community outreach programs." The word authentic, again, delivered with the same tone Henderson might use to describe an interesting artifact in his art collection. Marcus wondered if Henderson understood the difference between authenticity and performance, between genuinely honoring someone's story and putting them on display as an example of American opportunity. "I'm sure they'll enjoy meeting each other," Marcus said, though he was beginning to doubt everything about Friday's dinner. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of James Whitfield, a senior partner at another prestigious Phoenix firm. Whitfield was Old Phoenix money, his family name attached to schools and hospitals throughout the city. He'd always been cordial to Marcus, but there was something in his interactions that suggested he viewed Marcus as competent, but not quite belonging to their inner circle. "Richard, Marcus," Whitfield said, joining them without invitation in the way that men of his social standing felt entitled to do. "Congratulations on the Chen-Martinez deal. Quite a coup." "Marcus was just telling me about his family background," Henderson said. "Quite an inspiring story, actually. His mother built a restaurant empire from nothing." "How wonderful," Whitfield replied, his tone carrying just enough enthusiasm to be polite and just enough distance to signal his lack of genuine interest. "The restaurant business is so challenging. I imagine she works tremendously hard." "She does," Marcus said, feeling defensive despite himself. 16-hour days, especially in the early years." "I'm sure," Whitfield continued. "It's such a hands-on industry, isn't it? I imagine she's still very involved in the day-to-day operations. Quite different from our more cerebral pursuits." The dismissal was subtle, but unmistakable. Cerebral pursuits versus manual labor. Professional work versus service industry. Marcus felt his anger rising, not just at Whitfield's condescension, but at his own inability to defend his mother more forcefully. "Actually, she's quite sophisticated in her business approach," Marcus said, his voice tighter than he'd intended. "She's expanded strategically, developed innovative menu concepts, built strong community relationships. It requires the same strategic thinking as any successful business." "Of course," Whitfield agreed quickly, sensing he'd overstepped. "I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. I have tremendous respect for entrepreneurs, especially those who start with so little." But the damage was done. Marcus spent the rest of the lunch hyper-aware of every comment, every subtle assumption about class and background, and what constituted legitimate success. When Henderson mentioned looking forward to hearing about Marcus's mother's colorful journey, Marcus wondered if he meant inspiring or merely entertaining. After lunch, Marcus drove through Scottsdale's most exclusive neighborhoods, past houses that cost more than his mother had made in her first decade of business. He found himself at a red light next to a group of landscapers, mostly Latino men, taking a break from maintaining the perfect lawns of Phoenix's elite. For a moment, he saw his mother in their weathered faces, remembered her coming home exhausted from cleaning office buildings during his childhood, her hands cracked from industrial cleaning supplies. The memory hit him like a physical blow. His mother had worked jobs like that, cleaning, cooking, serving, to pay for his piano lessons, his SAT prep courses, his college application fees. She'd made herself invisible in service jobs so he could become visible in professional ones. And now he was worried about whether she would embarrass him in front of people who had never known real struggle. His phone rang as he pulled into his office parking garage. The caller ID showed his college roommate, David Chen, ironically sharing a surname with half of the deal that had made this dinner possible. "Heard about your big win," David said without preamble. $47 million. Not bad for a kid from the East Side. David was one of the few people in Marcus's life who remembered where he'd come from, who'd visited his childhood apartment and met his mother during their college years. He'd gone on to become a successful surgeon in San Francisco, but he'd never seemed to struggle with the same identity conflicts that plagued Marcus. "Thanks," Marcus said. "How did you hear about it?" "Legal news travels fast. Also, my mom saw your mom at the grocery store yesterday. Apparently, she's very excited about some fancy dinner you're taking her to." Marcus felt his stomach drop. The Phoenix Latino community was small enough that news traveled quickly between families, especially news about children's achievements. His mother's excitement about Friday's dinner had probably already made its way through her entire social circle. "It's a client celebration," Marcus explained. "The client wanted to meet team members' families." "That's great, man. Your mom deserves to see you in your element. She's so proud of you." "I know she is," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. David was quiet for a moment, picking up on something in Marcus's tone. "You okay? You sound stressed for someone who just closed the deal of the decade." "I'm fine, just tired." "Marcus," David said, his voice taking on the serious tone he used when delivering difficult diagnoses to patients. "Please tell me you're not worried about what your fancy colleagues will think of your mom." The directness of the question caught Marcus off guard. "It's not that simple." "It's exactly that simple. Your mother worked 3 jobs to put you through school. She taught you everything you know about work ethic and determination. If your colleagues can't appreciate that, they're not worth impressing." "You don't understand the dynamics here," Marcus said. "It's not just about appreciation. It's about fitting in, about maintaining professional relationships that took years to build. And what happens when you finally fit in so well that you've forgotten who you really are?" The question hung in the air between them, pointed and uncomfortable. Marcus ended the call promising to grab dinner with David the next time he was in Phoenix. But David's words echoed in his head for the rest of the afternoon. That evening, Marcus sat in his pristine downtown condo, surrounded by the markers of his success: expensive furniture, original artwork, a wine collection that had cost more than his mother's first car. Through his floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see the lights of the city stretching out toward the mountains, including the neighborhoods where his mother's restaurants served families not unlike the one he'd grown up in. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts, stopping at his mother's number. He could call her, suggest that perhaps Friday's dinner wasn't the right venue for her first introduction to his professional world. He could explain that client dinners were often boring, full of industry talk that might not interest her. He could protect them both from the potential awkwardness of worlds colliding. But as he stared at her contact information, Marcus realized that making that call would represent a choice about who he wanted to be. The successful attorney who had learned to navigate elite circles by carefully managing his background, or the son who honored the woman who had made his success possible. The decision felt impossible, weighted with years of careful construction of his professional identity and the growing awareness that authenticity might come at a cost he wasn't prepared to pay. Wednesday evening brought an unexpected phone call that would change everything. Marcus was reviewing contracts in his home office when his phone buzzed with a call from Jennifer, his assistant. "I'm sorry to bother you at home," she said, her voice carrying unusual tension. "But I just got a call from Richard Henderson's office. There's been a change regarding Friday's dinner." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. "What kind of change?" "Apparently, Henderson's wife Catherine has invited several members of the Phoenix Art Museum board to join the dinner. She's very excited about meeting your mother and wants to discuss potential collaboration opportunities for their multicultural initiatives." The words hit Marcus like a cold wave. What had been planned as an intimate business dinner for 12 people had now expanded into something resembling a cultural showcase, with his mother as the featured attraction. "How many additional people?" Marcus asked, though he dreaded the answer. 6 more couples, all prominent Phoenix arts patrons. Mrs. Henderson specifically mentioned wanting to highlight immigrant success stories as part of their upcoming exhibition on the American Dream. After Jennifer hung up, Marcus sat in his quiet office, staring at the city lights beyond his windows. The dinner had transformed from a business celebration into a performance, with his mother cast as the inspiring immigrant entrepreneur who would validate the liberal sensibilities of Phoenix's cultural elite. He imagined the scene. 18 wealthy patrons of the arts, eager to hear authentic stories of struggle and triumph, asking his mother to share details about her humble beginnings while they sipped wine that cost more than she'd made in a week during her food cart days. The thought made him feel sick. His phone rang again. This time it was his mother. "Marcus, me Joe. I just got the most wonderful call," she said, her voice bright with excitement. "Someone from Mr. Henderson's office called about Friday. They want me to speak about my business journey to some museum people. Can you believe it? They think my story might inspire other immigrants." Marcus closed his eyes, hearing the genuine pride and joy in her voice. "Mom, about Friday. I've been thinking about what to say," she continued, too excited to notice his hesitation. "I thought I'd start with the food cart, how I saved every penny for 6 months to buy it. Then I could talk about learning English by watching telenovelas and asking customers to correct my pronunciation. Oh, and the time the health inspector tried to shut me down, because he said my permits weren't in order, but really he just didn't like seeing a Mexican woman succeed. Each detail she shared made Marcus's anxiety spiral higher. Stories that sounded inspiring in the abstract would become uncomfortable realities when told to people who'd never faced real discrimination, never worried about permits being revoked for reasons that had nothing to do with health codes. "Mom," he said, his voice sharper than he'd intended, "maybe we should talk about this in person." "Of course, Mijo. Come over tomorrow after work. I'll make your favorite dinner, and we can plan what I should say." Thursday evening found Marcus sitting at his mother's kitchen table, the same place where he'd done homework throughout high school, where she'd helped him practice for job interviews, where they'd celebrated every milestone of his academic and professional journey. The familiar warmth of the space felt at odds with the conversation he was about to have. Maggie bustled around the kitchen, preparing chile rellenos and Spanish rice, humming contentedly as she cooked. She'd already shown him the dress she'd bought, elegant navy blue with subtle silver threading, appropriate but distinctive. She'd even made an appointment to have her hair styled. "I've been practicing my speech," she said, settling across from him with 2 cups of coffee. "Elena helped me time it. 8 minutes, just like you suggested. I start with arriving in Phoenix with nothing but hope and a 2-year-old son. Then I talk about the food cart, the first restaurant, the challenges of being a woman in business, and how watching you succeed made every sacrifice worth it." Marcus felt his throat tighten. The speech she'd prepared was perfect, inspiring, authentic, filled with genuine emotion. It was also exactly the kind of performance that would mark her as different, other, someone whose value lay in her story, rather than her presence. "Mom," he began, then stopped, unsure how to continue. "What is it, Mijo? You look troubled." Marcus stared at his coffee cup, watching the steam rise, buying time before he said the words that would shatter the excitement in her eyes. "I've been thinking about Friday's dinner, about whether it's the right venue for this kind of presentation." "What do you mean?" "These client dinners can be very formal, very specific in their focus. Sometimes family stories, even inspiring ones, can feel out of place in a business context." Maggie's smile faltered slightly. "But they specifically asked about my background. Mr. Henderson's office said they were excited to hear my story." "I know, but—" Marcus struggled to find words that would accomplish his goal without revealing the depth of his shame. "Sometimes these wealthy patrons of the arts, they're looking for entertainment rather than genuine connection. I don't want you to feel like you're performing for their amusement." "Performing?" The word came out quietly, but Marcus could hear the hurt beginning to creep into her voice. "Not performing exactly, but, Mom, these are people who've never struggled the way we did. They collect inspiring stories the way they collect art, as interesting curiosities rather than real experiences. I'm worried they might not truly understand what you went through." Maggie was quiet for a long moment, studying her son's face with the intuition that came from 37 years of reading his emotions. "What are you really saying, Marcus?" The direct question forced him to confront what he'd been dancing around. "I'm saying maybe it would be better if you didn't come to the dinner." The words hung in the air between them like a physical barrier. Maggie's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, hurt, and finally a kind of understanding that was worse than anger. "You're embarrassed by me," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. It's not about embarrassment. It's about context. About what's appropriate for different situations. "You think I'm not appropriate for your professional situation." Marcus felt trapped between honesty and cruelty. "I think these people have certain expectations about corporate dinners, and sometimes family backgrounds can be complicated in those settings." "Complicated?" Maggie repeated the words slowly. "My story is complicated." "Mom, please understand." "No, Marcus, you understand." Her voice was steadier now, but Marcus could see her hands trembling slightly as she set down her coffee cup. "For 37 years, I have supported every dream you've ever had. I worked 3 jobs so you could take piano lessons. I cleaned office buildings at night so you could attend debate camp. I sacrificed dates, friendships, my own social life so you could have opportunities I never had." Marcus felt tears threatening and hated himself for it. "I know that." I'm grateful for everything you did. Are you? Because right now it sounds like you're ashamed of everything I did. You're worried that your fancy colleagues will know that your mother worked as a cleaning lady, that she started with a food cart, that she doesn't have the right accent or the right background or the right education to sit at their table. That's not fair. What's not fair is spending 18 years teaching your son to be proud of who he is, only to discover that he's learned to be ashamed of who I am. The accusation hit harder than Marcus had expected, because it carried the weight of truth. He had learned to be ashamed, not of his mother's character or accomplishments, but of the visible markers of their different world that might make him seem less legitimate in the eyes of people whose approval he'd somehow decided mattered more than her feelings. I just want to protect you, he said weakly. Protect me from what? From people who might judge me? Marcus, I've been judged my entire life. By customers who assumed I couldn't speak English. By suppliers who thought a Mexican woman couldn't run a serious business. By your teachers who were surprised when you excelled because they had low expectations for kids from families like ours. She stood up abruptly, pacing to the kitchen window that looked out over the neighborhood where she'd raised him. I survived all of that because I knew it didn't matter what they thought. What mattered was what you thought. What mattered was that you knew the truth about who we are and what we've accomplished together. Marcus sat frozen at the table, understanding for the first time the full scope of what he'd asked her to sacrifice. Not just the dinner, but the validation that her story mattered, that her presence in his success was something to be celebrated rather than hidden. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry, Mom. Maggie turned from the window, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I know you are, Mijo. But sorry doesn't fix what you just told me. Sorry doesn't change the fact that my own son thinks I'm too embarrassing to be seen with his friends. The word friends hit Marcus like a slap. These people weren't his friends. They were professional contacts, clients, colleagues whose respect he'd somehow decided was worth more than his mother's dignity. They're not my friends, he admitted. Then why do their opinions matter more than mine? It was a question Marcus couldn't answer, at least not in any way that wouldn't reveal the depth of his betrayal of everything she'd taught him about self-worth and family loyalty. As he sat in his mother's kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of her love and sacrifice, Marcus realized he'd just made the worst decision of his life. But the words were already spoken, and the damage was already done. The silence that followed Marcus's departure from his mother's house was unlike anything Maggie had experienced in 37 years of single motherhood. She stood in her kitchen, staring at the 2 coffee cups still sitting on the table, the dinner she'd prepared growing cold on the stove. The navy dress hung in her closet upstairs, still bearing the tags, a symbol of excitement that had curdled into humiliation. She moved through her evening routine mechanically, washing dishes, turning off lights, checking the locks, while her mind replayed every word of their conversation. The careful way Marcus had avoided her eyes when he'd asked her not to come. The clinical tone he'd used, as if discussing a business problem rather than breaking his mother's heart. Her phone rang at 9:30. Elena's name appeared on the caller ID. How did the dinner planning go? Elena asked without preamble. Did Marcus like your speech? Maggie sank into her living room chair, the same one where she'd sat countless nights waiting for teenage Marcus to come home from school events, study groups, the part-time job at the bookstore that had taught him about professional environments. He doesn't want me to come, she said simply. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. When Elena spoke again, her voice carried the careful control of someone trying not to say something they'd regret. What exactly did he say? Maggie recounted the conversation, hearing her own words as if from a distance. With each detail she shared, the reality of what had happened became more solid, more devastating. Her son, the boy she'd raised to be proud, confident, unashamed of his origins, had asked her to make herself invisible rather than risk his professional image. That little. Elena caught herself. Maggie, I'm coming over. You don't need to do that. Yes, I do. Nobody should sit alone with this kind of hurt. While she waited for Elena, Maggie found herself walking through her house, looking at the photos that documented Marcus's journey from childhood to professional success. His high school graduation, where she'd cheered so loudly that other parents had turned to stare. His college acceptance letter, which they'd celebrated with a dinner at the fanciest restaurant she could afford. The day he'd passed the bar exam, when he'd called her crying with joy and gratitude. In every photo, every memory, she'd been present. Not as an embarrassment to be managed, but as the foundation upon which his success was built. Now she wondered if he'd been seeing her differently all along, if every milestone had been marred by his awareness of how she didn't fit the picture of the kind of mother successful men were supposed to have. Elena arrived with a bottle of wine, and the fierce expression she wore when someone had hurt her family. She took one look at Maggie's face and pulled her into a hug that smelled of her familiar perfume and the industrial-strength hand lotion she used after her shifts at the community clinic. "Talk to me," Elena said, settling them both on the couch with generous glasses of wine. "I keep thinking about all the things I could have done differently," Maggie said. "Maybe if I'd learned English faster, or learned to speak without an accent. Maybe if I'd gone to college later, taken some business classes, learned to talk about my restaurants in more sophisticated terms." "Stop." Elena's voice was sharp. "Don't you dare rewrite your story to accommodate his shame." "But maybe he's right. Maybe I don't belong in his world." "Maggie Chen-Rodriguez, listen to me very carefully." Elena set down her wine and turned to face her friend directly. "You built 3 successful restaurants from nothing. You employed dozens of people, contributed to the community, raised a son who became a successful attorney. If his world doesn't have room for the woman who made his success possible, then his world is the problem, not you." Maggie wanted to believe her friend's words, but the doubt had taken root. "You didn't see his face, Elena. The way he looked when he talked about his colleagues' expectations. He was genuinely worried about how I would reflect on him. And how does that make you feel?" The question was simple, but it forced Maggie to confront emotions she'd been trying to avoid. "Like I failed him somehow. Like despite everything I taught him about pride and self-respect, I raised a son who learned to be ashamed of his family." "Or maybe," Elena said gently, "you raised a son who got scared of losing what he'd worked for and made a terrible decision. That doesn't erase 37 years of love and support." They sat in contemplative silence for a moment, watching the lights of Phoenix twinkle through the living room windows. Finally, Elena asked the question that cut to the heart of everything. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," Maggie admitted. "Part of me wants to respect his wishes, to stay home and let him have his perfect dinner with his perfect colleagues. But another part of me—" "What?" "Another part of me is angry. Angry that I worked 3 jobs to pay for his education so he could learn to be embarrassed by the woman who made it possible. Angry that he thinks protecting his image is more important than honoring my sacrifices." Meanwhile, across town, Marcus sat in his downtown condo, staring at his phone and fighting the urge to call his mother and take back everything he'd said. The conversation replayed in his mind on an endless loop, each repetition making him feel smaller and more ashamed of himself. He'd driven home in a daze, his mother's words echoing in his ears. "My own son thinks I'm too embarrassing to be seen with his friends." The accuracy of the accusation was what made it so devastating. He had been worried about embarrassment, about how her presence might affect his carefully constructed professional image. His phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. "Confirmed final headcount for tomorrow. 20 people. Henderson's office sent the seating chart. Should I let them know about any changes to your guest list?" Marcus stared at the message, his finger hovering over the keyboard. He could simply reply that his mother wouldn't be attending, a last-minute conflict, a family emergency, any excuse that would preserve the fiction that this was anything other than his own cowardice. Instead, he found himself scrolling through his photos until he found the picture from his law school graduation. There was his mother in the front row, wearing a dress she'd saved for months to buy, beaming with pride as he walked across the stage. Her joy in that moment had been pure, uncomplicated by any concern about who was watching or what they might think. His phone rang. For a moment he hoped it was his mother calling to forgive him, to tell him she understood his position. Instead, David Chen's name appeared on the screen. "I just talked to my mom," David said, without preamble. "She heard about what happened from Elena." "What the hell is wrong with you?" Marcus felt his defenses rising. "You don't understand the situation. I understand that you asked your mother not to come to a dinner celebrating your success because you're worried about what some rich people might think of her accent. It's more complicated than that. No, it's not. It's exactly that simple and exactly that shameful. David's voice carried the anger of someone who'd never forgotten where he came from. Do you remember sophomore year when I was failing organic chemistry? Who called me every night to make sure I was studying? Who sent care packages when we were broke? Who believed we could become something more than anyone expected? Marcus remembered. His mother had adopted David like a second son during college, treating him with the same fierce protective love she'd shown Marcus. Your mother sacrificed everything so you could have choices, David continued, and you're using those choices to exclude her from your success. That's not growth, Marcus. That's betrayal. After David hung up, Marcus sat alone with the weight of his decision. Tomorrow night, he would attend a dinner celebrating the biggest professional achievement of his career, surrounded by colleagues and clients who would ask polite questions about his absent mother. He would navigate the conversation smoothly, maintaining the carefully curated image he'd spent years constructing. But for the first time, the cost of that image felt heavier than its benefits. He'd traded his mother's pride for his colleagues' approval, and the exchange felt like the worst deal he'd ever negotiated. In her house across town, Maggie Chen-Rodriguez was making a decision of her own. As she prepared for bed, she looked once more at the navy dress hanging in her closet. Tomorrow was Friday. Tomorrow was the dinner she'd been so excited to attend, the moment when her son's world would finally welcome her story. Marcus had made his choice about who he wanted to be. Now it was time for her to make hers. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crystal-clear Arizona sky that promised a perfect evening for an elegant dinner. Marcus woke before his alarm, having spent most of the night staring at the ceiling and replaying conversations from the past week. The successful attorney who should have been celebrating the biggest deal of his career felt instead like he was preparing for his own execution. He went through his morning routine mechanically: shower, coffee, scanning news headlines while his stomach churned with anxiety. The black tie dinner was 12 hours away, and he still hadn't figured out how to explain his mother's absence without revealing the truth about his own cowardice. At 9 a.m., his phone rang. Jennifer's voice carried unusual urgency. "Marcus, we have a situation. I just received a call from Mrs. Chen-Rodriguez." Marcus felt his heart stop. "What kind of call?" "She asked me to confirm the location and time for tonight's dinner. She said she wanted to make sure she had the correct address for the Capitol Grill." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. His mother was planning to attend the dinner despite their conversation Thursday night. She hadn't accepted his request to stay home. She'd decided to assert her right to be there. "What did you tell her?" Marcus asked, his voice barely steady. "I confirmed the details, of course. I assumed there had been some miscommunication when you said she might not be able to attend. Should I call her back?" "No," Marcus said quickly. "No, don't call her back." After hanging up, Marcus sat in his office chair, paralyzed by the realization that the decision had been taken out of his hands. His mother would be at the dinner tonight, ready to tell her story to Henderson's expanded guest list of arts patrons and cultural enthusiasts. Everything he'd tried to avoid was going to happen anyway. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Looking forward to tonight, Minjo. Proud to stand beside you as you celebrate your success." The message was simple, dignified, and completely devastating. No anger, no recrimination, just a mother's love and support, despite her son's rejection. Marcus stared at the text until his vision blurred with tears he refused to shed. Meanwhile, Maggie stood in her bedroom, carefully laying out the navy dress she'd bought for this moment. Elena sat on the bed, having arrived early to help with hair and makeup, and to provide moral support for what felt like the most important evening of Maggie's life. "Are you sure about this?" Elena asked, watching her friend apply lipstick with hands that trembled slightly. "Marcus made it pretty clear he didn't want you there." "Marcus is 37 years old," Maggie replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "He doesn't get to decide where I go or what I do. I was invited to this dinner by his colleagues, and I'm going to attend. And if he's angry, then he'll be angry. But I won't be invisible anymore." The decision had crystallized during a sleepless night of reflection. Maggie had realized that staying home would mean accepting Marcus's assessment that she was somehow inadequate, that her story was something to be ashamed of rather than celebrated. She'd spent 37 years teaching him to be proud of who he was. Now she had to model that pride herself. "What are you going to say if people ask about your background?" Elena asked. "The truth," Maggie said simply. "I'm going to tell them exactly who I am and how I got here. If that embarrasses Marcus, that's his problem to solve, not mine." At 6 p.m., the Capitol Grill buzzed with the energy of Phoenix's elite gathering for an exclusive celebration. The restaurant's private dining room had been elegantly appointed with white linens, crystal glasses, and fresh flowers. 20-place settings surrounded a beautifully set table where Phoenix's legal and cultural establishment would dine on perfectly prepared steaks and discuss the finer points of business and art. Marcus arrived early, impeccably dressed in his custom-tailored tuxedo, trying to project confidence he didn't feel. Henderson greeted him warmly, introducing him to the additional guests who'd been invited to meet, quote, the immigrant success story they'd heard so much about. "Catherine is particularly excited to meet your mother," Henderson said, gesturing toward his wife, who was deep in conversation with several museum board members. "She's been telling everyone about your family's inspiring journey, from humble beginnings to professional success." Marcus nodded and smiled, feeling like he was performing in a play where he'd forgotten his lines. Every few minutes he checked his phone, hoping for a message from his mother saying she'd changed her mind, that she understood his position and would respect his wishes. Instead, at exactly 6:45 p.m., Maggie Chen-Rodriguez walked into the Capitol Grill wearing her navy dress and pearl earrings, her gray hair styled elegantly, her posture straight with the quiet dignity of someone who had earned her place in any room she entered. Marcus watched from across the dining room as the hostess led his mother toward their party. She moved with grace and confidence, stopping to exchange pleasantries with the restaurant manager who recognized her from the culinary community. Several heads turned as she passed, a striking woman whose presence commanded attention without demanding it. When she reached their group, Marcus felt the entire evening shift into slow motion. Henderson approached her with the practiced charm of a man accustomed to hosting important dinners. "Mrs. Chen-Rodriguez, what a pleasure to finally meet you. I'm Richard Henderson. Marcus has told us so much about your remarkable business journey. Thank you for including me in your celebration," Maggie replied, her accented English clear and warm. "I'm very proud of Marcus's achievement." Marcus stood frozen as introductions were made around the circle. His mother shook hands with Phoenix's cultural elite, accepted their compliments about her restaurants, answered their questions about her background with the same straightforward honesty she brought to every conversation. "We're so looking forward to hearing your story," Catherine Henderson gushed. "Richard told me you built a restaurant empire from absolutely nothing. How inspiring." "I had something," Maggie corrected gently. "I had a son to raise and the determination to give him opportunities I never had. That's not nothing. That's everything." The response was perfect, gracious but proud, acknowledging struggle without apologizing for it. Marcus watched his colleagues' faces as they processed his mother's words, seeing genuine respect and admiration in their expressions. As they moved toward the dining room, James Whitfield, the man who dismissed restaurant work as non-cerebral, approached Maggie with surprising warmth. "Mrs. Chen-Rodriguez, I understand you've built quite a successful fusion cuisine concept. I'm ashamed to admit I haven't visited your restaurants yet, but after tonight, that will definitely change." "You're always welcome," Maggie replied. "Food brings people together in ways that nothing else can. I'd be honored to cook for you and your family." Marcus realized he was witnessing something he'd never expected. His mother not just fitting into his professional world, but enhancing it. Her warmth and authenticity were qualities these successful but sometimes sterile professionals rarely encountered. Rather than being embarrassed by her presence, his colleagues seemed genuinely drawn to her stories and perspective. But the real test came when they were seated for dinner, and Catherine Henderson stood to make an announcement. "Before we begin our meal, I'd like to ask Mrs. Chen-Rodriguez to share a few words about her journey. We're all so inspired by stories of determination and success, and I know everyone would love to hear how she built her business empire." The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Maggie. Marcus felt his heart pounding as his mother rose from her seat, poised and confident, despite the weight of 20 expectant faces focused on her every word. This was the moment he'd dreaded, the moment when his two worlds would collide completely. His mother was about to tell her story, their story, to the very people whose opinions he'd valued more than her feelings. As she began to speak, Marcus realized he was about to discover not just what kind of impression his mother would make, but what kind of son he truly was. Maggie Chen-Rodriguez stood at the head of the elegantly appointed table. 20 pairs of eyes focused on her with the kind of anticipatory attention usually reserved for keynote speakers at major conferences. The crystal chandelier cast warm light across her navy dress, and for a moment she allowed herself to appreciate the surreal nature of the moment. A woman who had once counted quarters from a food cart now addressing Phoenix's cultural elite. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson, for that lovely introduction," Maggie began, her voice carrying clearly through the private dining room. "When I woke up this morning, I didn't expect to be giving a speech tonight, but then again, most of the important moments in my life have been unexpected." Marcus watched from his seat, his hands clenched under the white tablecloth, as his mother found her rhythm with the natural storytelling ability that had charmed customers for decades. 35 years ago, I arrived in Phoenix with a 2-year-old son and less than $300 to my name, she continued. I spoke very little English, had no family here, no connections, no business plan. What I had was the absolute certainty that my son deserved a better life than the one I could give him in Mexico. Around the table, Marcus could see his colleagues leaning forward, genuinely engaged rather than politely tolerant. These were people accustomed to sanitized success stories, carefully crafted narratives that highlighted achievement while glossing over struggle. Maggie's raw honesty was something entirely different. "The first job I found was cleaning office buildings at night. I would carry Marcus with me because I couldn't afford childcare. He would sleep on blankets in empty conference rooms while I vacuumed and emptied trash cans." Her voice carried no self-pity, just the matter-of-fact recounting of someone who had done what needed to be done. Marcus felt his throat tighten as he remembered those nights, fragments of memory that had shaped his earliest understanding of work and sacrifice. He'd been too young to understand the significance then, but old enough to absorb the lesson that his mother would do anything to provide for him. "During the day, I worked at a factory assembling electronic components. The other workers taught me English during lunch breaks, correcting my pronunciation with patience I didn't deserve. I practiced by watching soap operas with closed captions, learning American idioms from dramatic storylines that bore no resemblance to my actual life." A ripple of gentle laughter moved through the room. Catherine Henderson nodded approvingly, clearly pleased with the authentic immigrant narrative she'd hoped to showcase. "After 2 years of this schedule, I had saved enough money to buy a used food cart. Not enough for permits, not enough for quality ingredients, barely enough for the cart itself. But I had something more valuable than money. I had recipes passed down from my grandmother, stories that could be told through food." Maggie paused, her eyes finding Marcus across the table. For a moment, their gazes locked, and he saw something in her expression that he couldn't quite identify. Not anger, not hurt, but a kind of reckoning. "The food cart was where I learned the most important lesson of my business career," she continued, her voice taking on a slightly different tone. "I learned that success isn't about hiding who you are to make others comfortable. It's about being so authentically yourself that people are drawn to your confidence rather than put off by your differences." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. His mother's words weren't just telling a story, they were delivering a message specifically intended for him. "I had customers who came to my cart not just for the food, but for the warmth and authenticity they couldn't find anywhere else. They didn't care that I spoke with an accent or that my cart wasn't as polished as the corporate restaurants downtown. They cared that I treated them like family, that I put love into every meal I prepared." James Whitfield, who had dismissed her work as non-cerebral just days earlier, was nodding thoughtfully. "That kind of authentic connection is incredibly rare in business today," he said. "Most companies spend millions trying to manufacture what you created naturally." "Thank you," Maggie replied graciously. "But I want to be clear about something. Building my business wasn't a fairy tale. I faced discrimination from suppliers who didn't take me seriously, customers who assumed I couldn't understand English well enough to take their orders correctly, inspectors who seemed to find violations that mysteriously disappeared when my male competitors were inspected. The room had grown completely quiet. The earlier social chatter replaced by the focused attention of people hearing truths they rarely encountered in their insulated social circles. But the hardest challenge I faced wasn't external. It was internal. As my business grew and I became more successful, I started encountering people who made me feel like I needed to apologize for who I was. People who suggested, sometimes subtly and sometimes not, that my accent was unprofessional, that my background was too humble, that my story was interesting but not quite sophisticated enough for certain circles. Marcus felt as if the room was tilting around him. His mother wasn't just telling her story. She was telling their story, including the parts he'd hoped would remain private. I'm ashamed to admit that for a while I let those voices get to me. I considered taking speech classes to lose my accent. I thought about hiring someone else to handle my public speaking so customers would hear a more polished voice. I almost convinced myself that success meant becoming someone other than who I was. Catherine Henderson leaned forward, clearly moved by the honesty of the narrative. "What changed your mind?" Maggie smiled, but there was something sad in her expression. "My son changed my mind. The same son I'd worked 3 jobs to support, who I'd driven to every school event in cars that barely ran, who I'd helped with homework in subjects I'd never studied myself. He reminded me that authenticity isn't something you compromise for acceptance. It's something you protect at all costs." Marcus felt the blood draining from his face as he realized where this was heading. "Or at least, that's what I thought he would remind me of," Maggie continued, her voice growing quieter but somehow more powerful. "Instead, just 2 days ago, that same son, now a successful attorney sitting at this very table, asked me not to come to this dinner because he was worried I might embarrass him in front of his colleagues." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus could feel every pair of eyes in the room turning toward him, but he couldn't look up from his plate. His mother had just exposed his shame to the very people he'd been trying to impress. He was worried that my accent, my background, my story of struggle would reflect poorly on his professional image. He was concerned that your opinion of him might change if you knew the whole truth about where he came from. Henderson cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mrs. Chen-Rodriguez, I'm sure there was some misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," Maggie said firmly. "My son was embarrassed by me. And you know what? I understand why." Marcus finally looked up, expecting to see anger or hurt in his mother's face. Instead, he saw something worse. Disappointment, mixed with a kind of tired resignation. "I understand because I raised him in a world that taught him to be ashamed of who we were. Every time I worked extra shifts to afford his tennis lessons at the country club, every time I dropped him off a block away from school events so his friends wouldn't see our old car, every time I quietly accepted condescending comments from other parents instead of defending our family's dignity, I was teaching him that our story was something to overcome rather than something to celebrate." The room was so quiet that Marcus could hear the distant sounds of the restaurant's main dining room beyond their private space. "So I decided to come tonight not to embarrass my son but to teach him one final lesson. The lesson I should have taught him 37 years ago. That the people worth knowing will respect you for who you are, and the people who don't respect you for who you are aren't worth knowing." She turned to look directly at Marcus, her voice soft but clear enough for everyone to hear. "Marcus, I am proud of everything you've accomplished. Your intelligence, your work ethic, your determination, those qualities didn't come from nowhere. They came from watching your mother work 3 jobs. From learning that dignity isn't determined by wealth or status, from understanding that love means showing up even when it's difficult." Tears were streaming down Marcus's face now, but he didn't care who saw them. "If these people think less of you because your mother started with nothing and built something beautiful, then they're not the kind of people whose respect is worth having. And if they think more of you because you had the strength to overcome obstacles they never faced, then they understand something important about character and resilience." Maggie reached into her purse and pulled out a business card, placing it in front of Catherine Henderson. "Mrs. Henderson, I understand you're interested in supporting immigrant entrepreneurs through your museum programs. If you'd like to feature authentic success stories, you're welcome to visit my restaurants and meet my employees. Many of them have stories similar to mine, stories of people who refused to let others define their worth. She stood to leave, pausing to address the room one final time. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it reminds you that the most interesting people you'll ever meet are the ones who've earned their success rather than inherited it, who've learned resilience through struggle rather than entitlement through privilege. As she walked toward the door, Marcus found his voice for the first time all evening. Mom, wait. She turned back, her expression unreadable. Marcus stood up, his legs shaky but his voice growing stronger with each word. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to meet my mother, Margaret Chen-Rodriguez. She's the strongest, most determined person I've ever known, and everything good about me comes from her. I'm sorry it took me 37 years to say that publicly, but I'm proud to say it now. The applause that followed was spontaneous and genuine, but Marcus barely heard it. He was focused entirely on his mother's face, watching as her expression shifted from resignation to something approaching forgiveness. I'm sorry, Mom, he said, crossing the room to embrace her. I'm so sorry I forgot who raised me to be. I know you are, Mijo, she whispered into his ear. And I forgive you. But more importantly, I hope you can forgive yourself and remember this lesson going forward. As they held each other in the middle of Phoenix's cultural elite, Marcus realized that his mother had given him one final gift. Not just her forgiveness, but the reminder that authenticity was more valuable than acceptance, that family loyalty mattered more than professional image, and that the people who truly deserved his respect were the ones who would value him for his character rather than his carefully constructed persona. The dinner continued, but it had transformed from a business celebration into something more meaningful. A reminder that the most important successes in life aren't measured by deal values or professional status, but by the relationships we nurture and the values we choose to honor, even when it's difficult. Later that night, as Marcus drove his mother home through the quiet Phoenix streets, they talked about the future, about family dinners where he wouldn't worry about what others thought, about bringing the right kind of woman home to meet the most important woman in his life, and about ensuring that the lessons learned tonight would shape every relationship going forward. The boy who had once been embarrassed by his mother's love had finally grown into a man worthy of it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.